Hi, this is Overdrive. In today's video I will show you how did I compose these two pictures and arrived with the final effect. So let's get straight to it. I naturally started by taking a couple of background pictures with my camera. I put it on a tripod to achieve a natural panning effect. You can also see that I took some pictures of random cars passing by to be further able to replicate how the sun reflects on the car and of course the shadow. Then, in my improvised studio, I wanted to picture the Audi in a similar way to match the lighting and most importantly, the perspective. From there, I was able to import everything into Lightroom and start with post-production. For the background, I included some minor adjustments relating to temperature, exposure, highlights, shadows, vibrance, saturation and hue to bring more reds and oranges. The car picture was overexposed and contrasting, so I wanted to compensate it with lifting down highlights and up with shadows and blacks. I also adjusted the temperature, saturation and hue to give it more orange look and align with the sunset palette. Then I was ready to export everything to Photoshop. I started with pasting the Clio picture to the background and aligning it with the main one. Then, the significant amount of work related to cutting the Audi out of its surroundings to be able to copy it to the background. I usually start with the magnetic lasso for this kind of work, but most patients would prefer the pen tool. In the next step, I put a white layer below the car to be able to better locate and clean up the edges. Further, I used the mask tool to preserve the source file while I was using the brush to smoothen it up. Doing this in more details now makes sure that the car would look more realistic in the final picture. A couple of final touches, including the transparency of the front window, and I could paste the Audi to its desired place. I used the Clio picture to better place the Lego car in the scene in terms of perspective. Then, I moved to start replicating the shadow of Clio onto the Audi. I concluded that in that way I will be able to achieve the most realistic effect. I divided the shadow in a couple of sections and aimed to match them accordingly with the car. For each section separately, I made some further adjustments, mostly with the use of a brush. Again, this took some time as I wanted to be a bit more detailed in the final effect. In the next step, I wanted to blend the car more into the scene by adding various blurs. First, I made multiple copies of the car and applied different levels of motion blur. The idea for the car was to become less blurry from left to right. Second, I applied radial blur to the wheels, separately for the front and rear, following with some more motion blur. Third, I cleaned up the left part of the car from multiple layers overlapping by using a brush on the mask. Afterwards, I took my first attempt at Lightroom. I slightly moved up the temperature of the car to match it more with the background. More important amendment here was, however, to cover the right part of the Audi in shadow, which you could notice for Clio as well. Back in Photoshop, I put some lens flares on top of the car and the fender. I colorized them in warm colors to match the composition. A few final touches in Lightroom, including minor texture cleanup and exposure, and we're done. You can see the final effect compared to the original picture. Moving on to the second composition, I used exactly the same tools and techniques. I similarly started by taking a couple of background pictures. Among them, there were some featuring the cars passing by, which I used to match the perspective and lighting. I selected another picture of the Audi taken in my improvised studio and began the adjustments in Lightroom. I pumped up the temperature, shadows and blacks, and made a couple of other small adjustments in line with the previous photo. Same for the car, I reduced the highlights, went up with shadows and blacks, played with temperature, saturation and hue. I also made some local adjustments with brightness and generally focused more on cleaning the dust and other spots on the picture. I spent some time cutting the Audi out of the photo by using a combination of magnetic lasso, polygonal lasso and brush over the mask to copy it to the composition. Again, the white layer below the car helped me going over the edges. The actual tip is to click Apply Mask after you're finished, which will be further helpful for grading the motion blur later on. Next, I pasted the car to the background and scaled it down accordingly. I separated the curb so I could put it as top layer and cleaned it up. In this photo, the shadow would not be that visible anyway, so in order to save time, I reused it from the previous composition. In the end, only some minor adjustments were necessary. I similarly added different levels of motion blur and used brush on the left part of the car to prevent layers from overlapping. Then, I applied radial blur to each wheel, following with a bit of motion blur. Back in Lightroom, I added shadow on the right part of the Audi, brightened up the rims, and made a couple of other minor changes. In Photoshop again, I applied similar lens flares at the top of the car, fender, and colorized them for a warm look. Since I wasn't happy with the gradual mask I put for the motion blur, I decided to reapply it once more. A few final touches in Lightroom, and this is it. Again, you can see the final effect compared to the original picture. That's all from my side. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching and maybe see you in the next one.